I love the iPhone Air. It's not a secret, that's obvious by the title, but I just want to explain why. As someone who's used the iPhone 16 Pro for the last year, who's used iPhones primarily for the last decade, why the iPhone Air makes sense to me. Why I think, despite the fact that a lot of the reviews are fairly negative about it, it seems, I think the phone actually makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. To be clear, is it the iPhone for everybody? No, but I think it may be the iPhone for more of you than you may realize. So to kind of just start by explaining what the iPhone Air is, what I was surprised to see is that this phone actually had a larger screen than the standard. So the standard 17 and the 17 Pro, those both have 6.3 inch screens, but the Air has a 6.5 inch screen. I don't remember seeing that in other reviews, and I was initially kind of surprised by that. It feels not quite as large as a Max phone. I used to have a 13 Pro Max in the past, and I decided to upgrade from that to a standard 16 Pro. Because as much as I loved the big screen with the 13 Pro Max, I always found that the weight was just too much, and it made it really awkward to use it in one hand. Really difficult, frankly. And as silly as it sounds, I remember a couple of times where I actually dropped the Pro Max on my foot, and it really hurt. I'm old enough to remember when phones were genuinely really small and light, and something like that just wouldn't have happened. So when I got the 16 Pro, I went into it largely because I was tired of that experience. The 16 Pro was a huge upgrade in terms of usability. One-handed use is certainly possible with that phone, and overall, it's a lot easier to manage the weight. With that said, there were still times, though, using the 16 Pro where I felt like it was a little bit heavy, where it was a little bit awkward to use in one hand. And frankly, with the Air, that is completely changed. So I bring up the screen size difference because you may be thinking because it's bigger, it would be harder to use in one hand, but that's not my experience at all. In fact, even though it's a little bit harder to perhaps reach the top of the screen with your thumb, because it's such a light phone, those finger or hand gymnastics you may be used to doing are overall a lot easier with this phone than they are with heavier phones. It's been so long since I've had a phone this light. I think the last phone I had that was this light was the original iPhone SE, and it is very refreshing, especially if you're using your phone as a phone, which I know many of us still do often. Putting it up to your ear, holding it up to your head, it's just so nice to have that light weight. So that also means putting it in your pocket. It just feels so satisfying to take it in and out of your pocket. It feels so light. I realize that some of this stuff may sound silly, but again, we use our phones all day, and you really do notice these things. Every person I've shown the Air to, who I've had them tested out for a moment, they were all shocked at how light it was. Again, it's been years since phones were this light, and it's the thinnest iPhone ever. So you really do notice that, and it really is nice. With that said, the cameras, that's something that a lot of people were concerned about. We only have one camera with this phone. And if you look at iPhones for the past several years, they've always had at least two cameras. Surely that must be a big issue. And I can tell you, at least for me, that really hasn't been a problem. I don't know if this has been your experience as well, but I don't really usually use the other cameras on my iPhone, at least not to take photos that I plan to keep. I mean, it's nice sometimes to be able to have that extra reach, but I always find the quality is a bit worse. And yes, with this last generation, the 17 Pro does have a better telephoto camera than it previously did. The sensor is larger, but I still think it's hard to argue that when we're talking about the iPhone, the main camera isn't always still the best camera. And that's the camera you have here on the Air. And again, going back to that whole design aesthetic question, I'm just going to admit, I think it looks a lot nicer. It looks a lot nicer to just have one camera on the back. I distinctly remember thinking when the first iPhone came out that had two cameras, I didn't really love how it looked. So I'm definitely not missing the extra cameras, and I think that unless you're someone who really does genuinely use those other cameras, or is buying your iPhone primarily to use it professionally for photo or video, I think you'll be just fine with the Air. And to another point that I do think is a bit more of a legitimate criticism of the Air, if we're talking about the topic of the speaker, I will admit it really isn't that great. Is the sound quality poor? Not particularly. It still sounds like an iPhone speaker, but if I'm being honest, it sounds more like the iPhone speaker on my original iPhone SE than the speaker on my 16 Pro. That's to say, it just doesn't get very loud. I was with a friend the other day and I was showing him a video on my phone, and while we could still hear it outdoors, it was a lot harder. I had to push the volume a lot higher up. So I really hope that if Apple does make a second generation of the Air, that they fix this, because overall this is something that most users will notice, and it is a clear downgrade from other iPhones. On the topic, however, of battery life, that's something that I really feel has been quite overblown. I'll admit, I'm not the heaviest user. I'm not someone who's on my phone all day long, but I do use my phone. It's not as though it's just sitting in my pocket all day. And I found the battery life so far has been basically the same as my 16 Pro. So I will frequently have days where I'm ending with about 40% battery, and I've even ended as high as 60%, maybe even a little higher in a few days, not totally sure. But point is, it's never dying on me. It's not even getting close to dying. And if you're someone who uses your phone all day long, I think it's pretty clear the right phone to get would be the 17 Pro Max. But if you're a more normal kind of user, I think you're going to find the Air has fine battery life. I was really concerned when I heard about the whole battery pack being made for it by Apple. I assumed we were going to have some really poor battery life. Many of you are probably old enough to remember when frequently phones released with extremely poor battery life. That isn't the case here with the Air. The battery life is fine. It's not max level battery life, but it's, I would say, standard iPhone, perhaps Pro level battery life. It's good enough, I think, and I find it completely serviceable. So overall, I think what we're seeing now is that Apple's approach has changed. They now have 4 different iPhone models. We have the 16e, which is there if you want just the cheapest iPhone. We have the standard 17, which is there for that kind of all-around standard price, really standard iPhone experience. We now have the Air, which you could say is perhaps taking the role that the Pro used to have, which is to say it's the premium iPhone. It's the one made with titanium. It's the one that looks the best, frankly, and it's also a bit more expensive. And then finally, we have the Pro, which is now actually a Pro iPhone in the sense that it doesn't really matter that it's thicker because it has better specs, it has more cameras, and for the right user, that's also the right phone. But for me, personally, think the Air is great. I think many of you would feel the same way if you decided to try it. So I certainly encourage you to get it if you're considering it. I think it's probably going to be a lot better than you may have expected. With that said, really appreciate you watching. Christian from Erickson Films, signing out.